So for this particular video, we're going to talk about the voice or point of view within the poem. So there are different components that you should look at when you're trying to decide who's speaking or what the point of view of the poem is. And we're not talking point of view like first person, second person, third person that you're used to thinking about when you are maybe reading a piece of literature and you're wondering what point of view it's written in. We're actually just trying to figure out who is the character, who is the speaker. Is it the author or the poet, or is it a character that this poet is trying to speak through? So oftentimes the voice in literature is the style that a certain author writes in. And that style is so unique to that author that we're often able to identify who the author is, especially if they're a very well-known author, merely by looking at the work. For instance, Emily Dickinson is a famous poet, and she writes very similarly in all of her poems. They're all very short. They all have lots of hyphens in it, and so you're able to identify her as a poet. In addition, Nikki Giovanni, which you guys read during a previous week assignments, she has that unusual style where she doesn't capitalize anything, she doesn't use any punctuation, and so you might easily be able to identify her poetry just by looking at it. So in order to figure out who is speaking, there are a lot of different devices or techniques that a poet utilizes that you might be able to look at in order to uncover who the speaker is or who the voice of the poem is. And those are here. Syntax, that's how the words are arranged in a piece. So sometimes they might be very flowery and flowy, other times they might be very choppy. And so the syntax or how the words are arranged might be one way to determine the voice. Semantics are the meanings behind the words. And when people say, oh, that's just semantics, this might be how you say one thing versus how another person says it, even though you guys are saying the exact same thing. But it's the meaning that the words carry. Diction is often another way to say word choice or how we speak. And we can think about diction a little bit like different ways that people speak depending on where they live in the country. So for instance, like an accent. Or you can think about how you might say the same thing to two different people. So for instance, if you're wanting to impress someone, maybe like a girlfriend or a boyfriend, you might ask for them to pass something to you across the table in a certain way. Like, will you please pass the paper? Versus a friend say, hey, give me that, right? So we're going to say it in a different way. So that is diction or word choice. You can look at the dialogue in the poem, and even if there aren't two characters or multiple characters in the poem, it might still be dialogue from one character to another character that they're speaking to, even though that character may not speak back. So you can look at it from that point, in that way to try to gain the point of view. Character development is how the character changes over the course of the poem. And so again, we can think back to that Nikki Giovanni poem, where in the beginning she was luxury when it was all about the material objects and she wanted to surround herself in luxury, and she talked about being in New York City and eating at fancy restaurants and all this stuff. And then by the end, she gets to the poem she gets to the end of the poem and says, but then you held me, and that's when I knew what luxury was. So that ultimate luxury is love. Forget about all those material objects. So the character changes even in the course of a 12-line poem in that instance. So you can look at the development or the change in the character. Tone is the feelings that are associated with the word choice that the poet decides to use. And so we can figure out if a poem is sad or if it's happy or if it's loving or if it's angry. So you want to look at the word choice that is incorporated into the poem to try to figure out the feelings that are trying to be expressed by the speaker. The pacing is going to be the speed with which the speaker is speaking or portraying their message. And we as readers might read a poem slowly at first glance, just because we're trying to figure out what it's saying. But as you read it over and over and over again, so give yourself like 5 or 6 times, you might start to see yourself speed up in certain areas of the poem. And this is going to be a really good one actually for you guys if you're choosing to do a spoken word poem, because you can see how the delivery goes. Certain parts are said more slowly, certain parts are sped up. So you can see like what different things are said in what different paces. And then finally, punctuation. So with punctuation, again, sometimes you have an abundance of punctuation, sometimes you have no punctuation at all. And how does that punctuation incorporate and play into the poem? So you can utilize all these different devices and techniques to try to figure out who is speaking. So if we go back to this mother to son poem that we started with yesterday when we were talking about figurative language, I'm going to talk to you guys about who the speaker is. And I highlighted some things on the next slide so I can give you some of the ideas that I looked at to figure out the point of view or voice of my poem. So I've got the red here, son, I'll tell you, and boy, and honey. And that last one should be blue. So son, I'll tell you, and boy, and honey. So here I've got, again, a mother speaking to her son. And so this is a little bit like with that character development or that dialogue between characters. I can kind of see that this is a mother who is caring, who's trying to give her son some wisdom, like bestow upon him some wisdom in life, right? And then I've got all this blue, ain't, and ice, I apostrophe S-E, a climbin', reachin', landin's, turnin', all with the I-N apostrophe because we don't put the G on it, going. And then that cause, you find it's kind or hard. So these are all things that are associated with diction. And again, that's the word choice. And we talked a few minutes ago about how it could be almost like a dialect or like she's from a different place, like her accent almost. So from the word choice here, I get the idea that this is not a very educated woman because she's not completing her words in their entirety. She's using words like ain't. And so again, those are kind of hints to me about this woman's background. And then I can extend that. I can say, okay, she's not that educated. Maybe that's why her life has been harder. Maybe she grew up poor. Maybe she's African American and she grew up in the South and things have been difficult for her because of civil rights and all that kind of stuff. So I can take the diction and the word choice and kind of make some inferences about who she is and who the speaker is and what the voice of the poem is. I see her tone in here. I see her attitude. She has a very positive attitude. Even though her life has been rough, she's telling her son not to give up. Pacing in here, I see that too. With it's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up. I kind of get her going through like, these have been all the problems I've been going through, and she rushes through them quickly. But then I'm still climbing and reaching landings and turning corners. So then she slows down there to really emphasize the point that she is going to work hard and she's going to work through these problems. So there's a lot of different things that we can look at in order to figure out who our speaker or our character in the poem is and what their point of view is on whatever message they're trying to portray. So what your task for today is you're going to look at the same poem that you were looking at yesterday, and you're going to identify your speaker. Who do you think they are? Like in my poem, it's a mother speaking to her son. What does that speaker think or feel? And why do they feel that way? So again, you're trying to make some inferences here. You're not going to necessarily know everything. You're going to have to read into it a little deeper. And then how do you know they feel these things or they think these things? What is it in the poem that gives you this information? So I'm going to ask you to try to identify some of those diction word choices or some of the dialogue or how the character changes, or look at the tone and the pacing. Look at the syntax, how the words are arranged, and you're going to try use those to decide how your speaker feels and how you know that. So good luck with this assignment. If you have any questions, please come by and see me. Thanks.